it's me, Koala, and today we're going to read The Witches by Roald Dahl. Now, you might not be able to understand my Aussie accent, so I'm going to put on a Scottish accent so that I can read you The Witches. Here we go. 3, 2, 1. That's better. How to Recognise a Witch by Roald Dahl. The next evening, after my grandmother had given me my bath, she took me once again into the living room for another story. "Tonight," the old woman said, "I'm going to tell you how to recognise a witch when you see one." "Can you always be sure?" I asked. "No," she said, "you can't, and that's the trouble. But you can make a pretty good guess. In the first place," she said, "a real witch is certain always to be wearing gloves when you meet her." "Surely not always?" I asked. "What about in the summer when it's hot?" "Even in the summer," my grandmother said. "She has to. And do you want to know why?" "Why?" I said. "Because she doesn't have fingernails. Instead of fingernails, she has curvy claws like a cat. And she wears gloves to hide them. Mind you, lots of respectable women wear gloves, especially in winter, so that doesn't help you much." "Mummy used to wear gloves," I said. "Not in the house," grandmother said. "Witches wear gloves even in the house. They only take them off when they go to bed." "How do you know all this, Grandmama?" "Don't interrupt," she said. "Just take it all in. The second thing to remember is a real witch is always bald." "Bald?" I cried. "Bald as a boiled egg," my grandmother said. I was shocked. There's something indecent about a bald woman. "Why are they bald, Grandmama?" "Don't ask me why," she snapped. "But you can take it from me that not a single hair grows on a witch's head." "How horrid!" "Disgusting," my grandmother said. "If she's bald, she'll be easy to spot," I said. "Not at all," my grandmother said. "A real witch always wears a wig to hide her baldness. She wears a fine class wig, and it's almost impossible to tell a real fine class wig from an ordinary hair unless you give it a pull and it comes off." "Then that's what I'll have to do," I said. "Don't be foolish," my grandmother said. "You can't go round pulling the hair off every lady you meet, even if she is wearing gloves. Just you try it and see what happens." "So that doesn't help much either," I said. "None of these things is good on its own," my grandmother said. "It's only when you pull them all together that they begin to make a little sense. Mind you," my grandmother went on, "these wigs cause rather serious problems for witches." "What problem, Grandmama?" "They make the scalp most terribly itchy," she said. "You see, when an actress wears a wig, or if you or I were to wear a wig, we would be patting it on over her hair, but a witch has to put it straight onto her naked scalp. And the underneath of a wig is always very rough and scratchy. It sets up a frightful itch on her bald skin. It causes many sores on her head. Wig rash, the witches call it. And it doesn't half itch." "What other things must I look for to recognise a witch?" I asked. "Look for the nose holes," my grandmother said. "Witches have slightly larger nose holes than other ordinary people. The rim of each nose hole is pink and curvy, like the rim of a certain kind of seashell." "Why do they have such big nose holes?" I asked. "For smelling with," my grandmother said. "A real witch has the most amazing powers of smell. She can actually smell out a child who is standing on the other side of the street on a pitch-black night. She couldn't smell me, I said. I've just had a bath. Oh, yes, she could, my grandmother said. The cleaner you happen to be, the more smelly you are to a witch. That can't be true, I asked. Absolutely clean children give off the most ghastly stench to a witch, my grandmother said. But that doesn't make sense, Grandmama. Oh, yes it does, my grandmother said. It isn't the dirt that the witch is smelling, it is you. The smell that drives a witch crazy actually comes right out of your own skin. It comes oozing out of your skin in waves, and these stink waves, as the witches call them, go floating through the air and hit the witch right smack in her nostrils. They send her reeling. Now wait a minute, Grandmama. Don't interrupt, she said. The point is this. When you haven't washed for a week and your skin is covered over with dirt, then, quite obviously, the stink waves cannot get out of your skin nearly so strongly. I shall never have a bath again, I said. Just don't have one too often, my grandmother said. Once a month is perfectly suitable for a child. It was at moments like these that I loved my grandmama more than anything else. Grandmama, I said, if it's a dark night, how can a witch smell the difference between a child and a grown-up? Because grown-ups don't give out stink waves, she said. Only children do that. But I don't really give out stink waves, do I? I said. I'm not giving them out at this very moment, am I? Not to me you aren't, my grandmother said. To me you smell like raspberries and cream, but to a witch you smell disgusting. What do I smell of? I asked. Dog's droppings, my grandmother cried. I reeled. I was stunned. Dog's droppings, I cried. I do not smell of dog's droppings. I don't believe it. I won't believe it. What's more, my grandmother said, speaking with a touch of relish, to a witch you would smell of fresh dog droppings. That's not true, I cried. I do not smell of dog's droppings, stale or fresh. There is no point arguing about it, my grandmother said. It's simply a fact of life. I was outraged. I simply couldn't believe what my grandmother was telling me. So if you see a woman holding her nose as she passes you in the street, she went on, that woman could easily be a witch. I decided to change the subject. Tell me what else to look for in a witch, I said. The eyes, my grandmother said. Look carefully at the eyes, because the eyes of a real witch are different from yours and mine. Look in the middle of each eye, where there is normally a little black dot. If you see, if she is a witch, the black dot will keep changing colour. You will see fire, and then you will see ice, dancing right in the very centre of the coloured dot. It will send shivers running all over your skin. My grandmother leant back in her chair. I squatted on the floor, staring up at her, fascinated. She was not smiling. She looked deadly serious. Are there other things? I asked her. Of course there are other things, my grandmother said. You do not seem to understand that witches are not actually women at all. They look like women, they talk like women, and they are able to act like women. But in actual fact, they are totally different animals. They are demons in human form. That is why they have claws and bald heads, strange noses, and peculiar eyes, all of which they have to conceal as best they can from the rest of the world. What else is different about them, Grandmama? The feet! Witches never have toes. No toes? I cried. What do they have instead? They just have feet, my grandmother said. The feet have square ends with no toes on them at all. Doesn't that make it difficult to walk? I asked. Not at all, my grandmother said, but it gives them problems with their shoes. All ladies like to walk in rather pointed shoes, but a witch, whose feet are very wide and square at the ends, has the most awful job squeezing her feet into those neat little pointed shoes. Why doesn't she just wear comfy shoes instead of pointed shoes? I asked. She dare not, my grandmother said. Just as she hides her baldness with a wig, she must also hide her ugly witch's feet by squeezing them into pretty shoes. Isn't that terribly uncomfortable? I said. Extremely uncomfortable, my grandmother said, but she has to put up with it. If she's wearing ordinary shoes, it won't help me to recognise her, will it, Grandmama? I'm afraid it won't, my grandmother said. You might possibly see her limping very slightly, but only if you're watching closely. Are those the only differences then, Grandmama? There's just one more. What is it? Their spit. It's blue. Blue? I cried. Not blue. Their spit can't be blue. Blue as a blueberry, she said. You don't mean it, Grandmama. Nobody can have blue spit. Witches can, she said. Is it like ink? She said. Exactly. They even use it to write with. They use those old-fashioned pens that have nibs and they simply lick the nib. Can you notice the blue spit then, Grandmama? If a witch was talking to me, would I be able to notice it? Only if you looked carefully, my grandmother said. If you looked very carefully, you would see a slightly bluish tinge on their teeth, but it doesn't show much. It would if she spat, I said. Witches never spit, my grandmother said. They daren't. I couldn't believe my grandmother would be lying to me. She went to church every morning of the week and she said grace before every meal. And someone who did that never lies. I was beginning to believe every word she spoke. So there you are, my grandmother said. That's about all I can tell you. None of it's very helpful. You can still never be absolutely sure whether a woman or a witch is one or the other just by looking at her. But if she's wearing the gloves, if she has the large nose holes, the strange eyes, and the hair that looks like it might be a wig, and if she has a bluish tinge on her teeth, and she has all of those things, you run like mad. Grandmama, I said, when you were a little girl, did you ever meet a witch? Once, she said. Only once. Wow, that was a bonza story. Can you guess now who's behind this mask? See you soon.